So just without further ado, I'm just going to kick it over to AK, but this is meant to be our program. So like the more that we put into the surveys and the more that we participate within them, we'll be able to further customize and make sure we're going in the right direction. So without further ado, AK, take it away.
Well, I'm just super excited just to be having this conversation with you again today. And I'm also going to have part of my team also helping with these conversations as well, Yasmin Zipour, and also Cameron, who's going to be helping on the support side. Now, the reason I'm so excited to really talk about this is because of this work. And I think we know that right now in the United States, the country is becoming more and more racially divided. And it is our goal to find ways to engage in conversations, especially when we're talking about navigating difficult conversations, to really start this work in a really meaning and impactful way. Now, as I want to just look at this quick quote, right? Now, about 3/4 of Blacks and Asians, or 76%, said they have experienced racial discrimination. Okay? And within that, 2/3 of whites would say that they've never experienced this. Okay, so talking a little bit, just as you look at that, take a few moments just to think about that. Okay. Now, as we're talking about race, especially in this country and racial injustice, like why would we say that particular quote from Pew Research is important and valuable to know? Why would we say it's important? And just shout it out.
It's surprising that the white number isn't like 98%.
Expand on that, James.
It's I don't know where a white person would say that they have been treated unfairly, because of their race, given that historically and even today in our country, it is by and large white people that control whatever and kind of fill in the blank, higher education, finance, access to resources, government. So it's hard to say why they would experience racism. And then the flip side is, I think, why a lot of people would say, well, I'm not racist, I've never done anything racist. I think by definition, if you're not white and you're being asked to participate in a system where you don't control any of the resources, even if no one there is doing anything explicitly, any kind of explicit hostile acts to you, hostile not just physical, but of any kind, it's hard not to feel like the system's set up against you if you don't see anyone who looks like you or comes from your background that is in any kind of position of control.
Right. It's extremely important because just want to know, somebody has a little bit of markings on the screen just to let you know.
I thought those were like validations of what I was saying, so I was feeling good. Every
Plus one, you get
some
plus ones. You get some plus ones.
It's good feedback. I appreciate that.
But it's important. The reason why it is so important is because we're going to talk a lot about engaging in difficult conversations, but also biases and understanding that our worldviews may be different. Now, within that same study, you will also see that it also changes depending on your political affiliation as well. Now, within the first, it says Republicans versus Democrats, focusing mainly on white liberals and right Democrats. It states that in terms of equal rights in our country, individually left would say that 64 has not done enough, while 31% of Republicans have said that we've gone too far. Right. In addition to the one talking about how slavery affected the position for Blacks in American society, I'm not saying it's a political thing, but Republicans that lead left would say that, not much or not at all, while individuals leaning right would say that 80% that slavery has made and held Blacks back in this country. And the same is talking about discrimination within this country, also how that changes. Now, the reason why that's important is because our lived experiences may be extremely different. And because of our personal lived experience, it now may also be affecting policy. Right? Does that surprise anybody? This study from Pew Research? right?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Sally?
And this is important because when we're talking about the stuff we're going to be talking about today, especially engaging in conversation, this is going to be extremely important to really think in the back of your mind. Now, when we're looking at the survey data, we noticed that one of the main questions that people had was about how do we do systemic racism in this country? And it seems such like a big behemoth in the room, but we don't think about there's actually 4 dimensions when we think about racism. The first one is the internal. Right? This is our personal thoughts, our feelings, our actions, or even our prejudices. So what we did for the first sessions of knowing your why or understanding yourself, that was what we were doing, is really understanding who are we, what is our stories, and how did we come to be to who we are today. And the second one is interpersonal. Now with the interpersonal, this is basically the acts of racism between one person to another. And today, as we focus on engaging in difficult conversation, it's really focusing on this element, like how do we really improve engagement and communication with people inside of our community and even outside of our community. Next is the institutional side of things. When you think about the institution, this is actually within our organizations or our workplace. This can be hiring practices. And especially when you think about interpersonal and how that leads into institutional, is we can actually influence these main areas and how we want to put institutional action into place based on maybe our seat at the table, or even in terms of what we can actually do structurally to make some change. And oftentimes institutional is interchanged with systemic, but systemic is how do all of these 3, internalized, interpersonal, and institutional, actually survive in this environment, right? How do all of these play a place in the world in which we live today? Now, as we look at just this overall roadmap, as some people are thinking about, like, how is this all going to play out within this overall TBA roadmap? First was really understanding ourselves, then engaging in difficult conversation. We're going to be doing today. And then next, we're going to move that into conversations within the congregation, really diving deep into these conversations, what we can actually do institutionally. And then next, we're going to bring it up into a higher level, talking about the systemic matters of providing educational resources and content to really brighten our worldview, and then next, really making an impact and about how we're going to move forward. And today, we're going to be giving you some frameworks to talk about navigating these difficult conversations, reflecting on some of our biases, and also providing a framework for you to be able to easily manage these conversations. And at the end, we're going to provide opportunities to have an open discussion to really talk about some of these topics. Okay, any questions? Okay. And to really help us navigate some of these conversations, I'm going to introduce my partner in crime, Ms. Yasmin, and she's going to talk about some of her work in introducing this easy framework and engaging in difficult conversations.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here today. And thank you for inviting us to speak with you on this. My name is Yasmin Zarapor. So the reason I'm joining in is because my background is in negotiations. I did my PhD at MIT in environmental policy and planning, look at how you can apply negotiations tools and principles to help groups make better environmental policies. Since finishing my PhD, I've spent the last couple of years at Boston College teaching environmental studies courses there, and have been involved as a facilitator for the Courageous Conversations for Racial Justice events at BC, and also have used a lot of this framework in my own class. So the way that I teach negotiations in my environmental classes is really as a life skill. So even today, we went over this book, Difficult Conversations, and I wanted to highlight what I thought were some of the easy takeaways from Difficult Conversations for you in this overly simplified, easy framework, which is E is to engage to learn, not to win. A is to acknowledge emotions and respond. S is to separate the person from the problem. And Y is about recognizing that your impact may not be what you intended. So in a minute, I'll send you a link to a longer handout that breaks each of these down a little bit more. Oh, I think Coach AK did that.
Yep, I'll just put that in the link.
All right, thank you. Good teamwork. So I think from there, I'll just turn it over back to Coach AK to get us started on the first activity.
Fantastic. So as we start the first activity, our goal today is really to level set and really find ways to connect with one another and using this easy framework. Now, everybody last week, when we were finding or knowing our number ones, we had a chance to connect. And today we're going to put you into pairs to share your number ones with the group. To go over that, what we're going to focus on is one is give 8 minutes to do this. We're going to have you practice engaging and learning and really acknowledging some of these emotions. And there's going to be a partner one is really just going to share how you felt about your process of finding your number one. And number two is going to be focusing on asking open-ended questions and really actively listening on the first and second step, right? But to model this before we get into the breakout rooms, I'm actually going to have Jody. We're going to model this for you today. On the last session, Jody came in and she wanted to share her number one. And today we're going to dive just a little bit deeper into that. So Jody, how are you today?
I'm nervous. Yeah, to be honest, yeah.
Well, go deeper in that. What do you mean? Tell me about what makes you nervous at the moment.
Well, it feels very vulnerable to share. I know a lot of the people here. I don't know a lot of the people here too, and I feel like I'm really like taking a part of myself that's me. I mean, that's really the core of me, and giving it out to the group. And you know, so what are my fears? My fears are I'm going to be judged. The fears that it's not good enough. The fears that I don't belong here. You know, so that's my vulnerability.
And I just want to say thank you for just being open about that, because sometimes when we're about to share or communicate, we get this weird feeling in our stomach and it tightens up, and we oftentimes hold ourselves back. But all I want you to do, Jody, as we are having this conversation, is just be you and answer normally, okay? As comfortable. All right, we'll shake it out. And everybody, obviously.
We love you, Jody. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. So Jody, I mean, just first and foremost, just thank you for sharing parts of your story with us. But I know you started and you had a list of your items that make you who you are. Can you just tell me a little bit that process and how you got down to your number three, your top three?
So my top three, well, I had 22.
Okay.
So getting rid of 11 was not that hard. And then the top three, I thought, like, what in me made all those 22 possible?
Okay. And what was your number three?
My number three is being a woman.
Okay. Okay. Tell me about that.
And just as a little aside, I think it's interesting that I didn't put white woman or Jewish woman, but I felt like it was like we weren't doing generalities. We wanted to go specific, right? So I felt like as a woman, I think that women tend to see the world, how are we the same, and not how are we different. And that has influenced me as a mother, as a partner, as a friend, and I've developed, I think, empathy and sympathy towards the other because I've experienced being the other as a woman.
Okay. And so you have number three as being a woman. Then what did you have for your number two? We got you. Thank you for sharing.
I forgot to bring Kleenex. Yeah, I don't have. My number two was faith and trust in God.
Okay. Tell me more about that.
Well, that I navigate, I've learned and in my heart to navigate the world, that I'm not alone. No matter how alone I feel in the world, that my God is always with me, and that my God loves me unconditionally, and that my faith guides me in the actions that I take.
So if your number three was woman, number two is God, then I'm wondering what your number one was. What's your number one?
Okay. Now I really need Kleenex. So my number one is not something that I really share with a lot of people. I think there's a lot of stigma around what I'm about to share. And again, like I said, my fear is like that I'm going to be judged or whatever. Okay, I'm just gonna put it out there. So my number one is being in recovery. That I discovered over 20 years ago that I had an addiction problem, that I was addicted to alcohol and pills and anything that would take me out of myself, anything that would help me navigate the world, have a buffer, would numb me out. And well, a quick story was, many of you know I'm a sign language interpreter, and I was sent to interpret at a youth treatment facility. And truthfully, I had an 8-ball of cocaine in my pocket as I went to this treatment facility to interpret about addiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
And first of all, and I'm the person that people would say, you, Jody? Oh, never. You're so good. You're a straight A student. How could this possibly? Oh, no, really? No, this is me, right? I hid it. I hid that part of me from everyone in my life, including my ex-husband for a while. So I'm sitting in a treatment facility interpreting a young woman who is sharing her story about addiction and recovery. And the words that she's speaking is my story. She's talking about filling the hole in her soul with alcohol, with drugs, with chasing after anything to get out of herself. And she talked about how she was able to stop drinking and stop drugging and find a way to love herself through AA, through Alcoholics Anonymous. And I was weeping while I was interpreting. I really just broke down while she was sharing. And after the meeting, I went up to her and I said, I need help. Can you help me? And she told me where I could go to my first meeting. And I went to it, quaking and shaking. I went to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And I'll just, sorry, just to share with you guys. So I sat in the back of the room. It was at Faulkner Hospital. I sat, a big auditorium, and I sat way in the back, and I went, this is not me. I don't fit here. Jews are not drunks. Jews do not have addiction problems. This is not me. And the first speaker was a man who, booming voice way down in front in the auditorium, wearing a huge Star of David. And I went, well, that shoots that one down, and he talked about being Jewish. And I went, oh, I guess I do belong here.
Yeah.
And that began my 20-year journey. I've been clean and sober for 20 years. I'm very active in Alcoholics Anonymous. I interpret 1 million meetings. I go to 1 million meetings. And the recovery process has helped me uncover myself, my authentic self, not lying, cheating, stealing, manipulating me, but who I am authentically. And I continue to learn tools through recovery programs to allow my authentic self shine in the world.
Well,
So that I wouldn't have my faith in God if I weren't clean and sober. I wouldn't be a full person as a woman if I didn't have recovery. I wouldn't have my family. I wouldn't have my children. I wouldn't have my job in an authentic way unless I was in recovery. And that's why I chose that as my number one.
Very powerful. You're talking a lot about your family, and I know, especially what we're talking about, social justice, and you were talking about, being active and taking that step, moving forward. Like, when you think about what we're talking about today, how does that reflect on you? Your thoughts on that?
Well, this is so important to me within the congregation because my children are biracial, and we've experienced a lot of racist incidents within the congregation and without, of course. And a lot of it is not on purpose. It's not meant. I know people don't mean it, but people don't realize the consequences of their or they don't ask questions, or even like staff, religious school staff, they don't think to add, it's sometimes it's the old we don't see color thing, where color is so important to a person's identity. This didn't happen at Temple, but I used to live right near Schechter, the playground at Schechter, and our kids would play there. And Schechter, the Jewish school. And there are always kids running around and they wear kippas, right? And my little one, when he was, I think, 5 or 4 or 5, he found a kippah on the ground and he put it on his head. And a teacher came running over and snatched it off his head and said, "You can't wear that." And Micah went, "I'm Jewish." And that was, the assumption that he's Black, so he can't possibly be Jewish, right?
Yeah.
And that those kinds of incidents, I mean, I have so many, I could take up the whole 90 minutes.
Well, I just want to say, thank you for, really sharing. And especially because you said you were, your stomach was kind of tightening up and you're super nervous. But for me, it actually just really opened up my heart to see you more than just Jody. And so I just want to thank you for obviously your courage and just sharing that, because especially today, the conversations that we need to happen around the world sometimes may be difficult, right? Sometimes may be hard to actually do, but by sharing, we will never know the perspective of somebody else. So I just want to say thank you for just sharing your story. And I know there's much more, but just thank you for really modeling that and sharing parts of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me this.
Thank you.
It's very healing for me too. I think everybody, can I just say one more thing?
Yeah.
I think stories are so important. I think everybody's got stories and I think everybody wants to be listened to. And that's why I think this kind of a conversation is so powerful.
Thank you. And Jody couldn't have said it any better as we're transitioning to the next process, as we're about to go into breakout rooms and you're going to have a partner. And what we want to do is just kind of model the same. It's simply just asking a question. And our goal is just to learn, to see how it feels to step into somebody else's life for a moment as they share the process as they got to their number ones. So momentarily there will be a notification as you're going to get into your breakout rooms, and then just share. And obviously I say, if you're kind of going back and forth, who's going to go first? The person with the lighter shirt, or we'll say the lighter hair goes first, whatever you decide. And we'll give you 4 minutes to do that each, and then also use the easy framework, that link to engage in those conversations. But once the link comes, just click on that, and we'll see you in about 9 minutes. But thank you, Jody. Thank you very much.
All right. So we're going to take full advantage of the chat function right now. I want you to think about what the other person did that made you feel safe to share. So how did they signal to you their curiosity and their level of engagement? So go ahead and put that into the chat window, and then if anyone wants to mention it out loud too, that would be great. Great. Susie, when you say your partner was friendly, engaging, and open, what did friendly look like?
Oh, I mean, he had a lovely persona and a beautiful smile and very kind eyes. I mean, he was very warm, and I mean, I don't know, he was just lovely. And, I mean, I don't know, I liked him. And his wife was there, and she was just participating in a passive way, but I don't know, he facilitated the conversation, asked a lot of questions, and I don't know, just a very friendly, genial person.
Yeah, great. So you are all at an advantage in the sense that you are all coming from the same community. So it's assumed that you'll all be friendly with each other, right? When we talk about discussions on race, they can be really uncomfortable. And oftentimes we enter into them sort of hoping to win the conversation or to help enlighten the other side. And instead, what we want you to encourage to do is to do what you did even in this simple exercise, which is to be open, to ask open-ended questions, to make them feel comfortable even making mistakes or saying the wrong things, right? A lot of times we hold ourselves back from engaging these conversations because we're so fearful of being judged or of saying the wrong thing. So you have to create a safe environment, whether it's, you know, at a personal level or whether it's in a community, to actually have these conversations. The second part that we wanted to highlight with this is that this exercise asks you to be vulnerable and to open up, just like these conversations about race do. And so we will encourage you throughout the night to be as open as you possibly can. If you want to add anything else about what made you feel comfortable, feel free to add it in the chat. Just for the sake of time, we're going to shift to the next exercise.
Yeah. And I think it's really important, especially as we're going through today, talking about engaging these conversations. We want you to almost imagine that you're speaking to everyone as though it is their number one, right? If it is their number one, you aren't going to try to win or lose this conversation. Your goal is to understand and learn. And as we were sharing some of our number ones, we also realized that we could all be in the same congregation, all in the same place, but we could also have different lived experiences. This is a lot when we're talking about what really shapes our worldview. And this is a little bit in terms of the survey topics that were brought up. People want to know about, what about our biases that we have, and how do we address them and learn from them, and how can we address them to move forward to have a greater sense of awareness? Now, if anyone's unfamiliar with what unconscious biases are, it's really just the social stereotypes about the certain groups or individuals from outside of our own awareness. It's unconscious for a reason. We don't know what we don't know. But as we're moving forward, we can, in fact, be intentional about how we can actually go from not knowing to knowing. And one of these is the confirmation bias, right? Oftentimes we have a tendency to only limit our worldview that already confirms with our current beliefs. And you may have seen this if you've ever seen the movie or the documentary, The Social Dilemma, where our feeds are actually now programmed or made that already align with our worldview, or it might be the news stations that we actually watch. Our goal would be, how can we actually go and actually search the opposite side to get a full perspective? In addition, it is the framing effect. You might have also seen the framing effect is how we actually frame the conversation or the topic actually creates what the topic is going to look like. For example, if you're thinking about in terms of race in this country and you're looking about the protests, if you bring it up as protest, it might be very different if you bring it up as looting. But the first thing that comes into our mind really actually shapes our worldview. So when we're bringing out information or we're deciding to share information, making sure how we frame it or the content that we share is also from both sides. And last is survivorship bias. And this is something that I've heard a lot about. And this is basically you use a subgroup or a person within that group and you put them up almost on this pedestal as that's now the new bar. This happened a lot with Barack Obama, where people were saying, well, Barack Obama's president, now racism in this country is over, right? Instead of thinking about, well, maybe to be the president of the United States takes some special effort and some skill, and that just because that happened doesn't mean that it's now as easy for everybody else to do. Now, we're just touching on this a little bit because we will send some more information on these topics for you to just dive in a little bit deeper. But we're going to bring you into, oh, sorry, there's one actually, sorry. And there's also in-group bias. And the last one is basically in terms of people that are usually aligned with our groups or our worldview. It usually creates these silos for us. And this can be our political affiliation. It could be having all one gender in a boardroom. So making sure that you have a diversity of thought and presence also helps us spread out that worldview. Now to do this, we're going to break you into groups again, and we're going to have Yasmin talk about this, but it's really about now we're going to start diving deep in to actually have these really enticing and important and impactful conversations. Let's pile it in.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll just say put in the chat as everyone was talking, and I know we were, Yaz and Becca were talking a little bit about like how are those conversations going, right? We weren't able to jump into each of the rooms, but in the chat from 0 to 5, 5 being like, oh, that was the most comfortable conversation I had. We were laughing, we were giggling, to 1 being like, I was afraid to say anything. Can you just put in the chat like how comfortable you felt to have answer those questions and have that conversation? Okay, we had a lot of 4s and a lot of 5s. Okay. Can get to number 3, okay. Now, let's imagine, same situation, same questions, but we were to put you into a room with people or individuals that were a different racial background than you. How comfortable would you have felt to have those same conversations? 2. Okay. Now, I'll say, for example, Stacey, we see the difference. The 3s, 1s to 3s and 4s to 5. So I saw Stacey, for example. What would have made that conversation uncomfortable? If you feel comfortable to share.
I think that, oh, wow. I think because I wouldn't have known the person, I wouldn't have known their background, their history, I just wouldn't have felt as comfortable knowing their profile.
Okay. And then let's say you had there was somewhat of a relation to that person.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of just the personal side, what about just the context? How comfortable would you have felt to share your experiences regarding racism or just your thoughts and where those were shaped from?
I would feel a lot more comfortable if it was someone that I knew. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but from a different racial background.
It definitely would have gone up to like a 3.
Okay. Okay. Now, does anybody say, in terms of what Stacey said, thank you for that, is how much of it was based on knowing the person, right? And you can raise your hand if it's knowing the person, versus it was just me talking about race or those topics that might have been uncomfortable because it was the content of the piece. So the first one is, raise your hand if it would be more of the personal, that there's no network, there's no connection. Okay. And then what about the content? Okay. Anyone with the content, would you just be able to share what would you been worried about with the content wise?
I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Okay. Anybody's feelings? Now, thank you for sharing that as well. What do you mean by hurting somebody's feelings? What do you mean?
I wouldn't want to say something that would make somebody feel more ostracized or uncomfortable or in a position to have to defend themselves against something stupid I might have said.
Okay. And that's very interesting and very, very, very common. So when you had to think about a difficult conversation that you've had, we'll say, with somebody from a different racial background, could you put into the chat just one sentence, like what that topic was about? Right? Let's say you had a conversation with somebody from a different racial background, like what that conversation was about. And then maybe some words after that, like how did that conversation go? Right? Was it a good conversation? Was it a difficult conversation? Was it understanding? A good conversation. So Susie, tell me about that. Like what was the conversation? What made it a good conversation?
Well, it was a conversation, not surprisingly, about the current situation with a friend of mine who's an African-American woman who also happens to be a lesbian. And we were just talking about her experience in the last several years with how the current, I hate to use the word president because he's no president, but how he's really kind of, how he's unleashed all kinds of ugly and hate, and how that's affected not just her, but her son, and what that experience is going to be like for him growing up. He goes to school with my daughter and their friends, and how, that is going to affect, I mean, in not necessarily a bad way for these kids who understand, all the wrong that it is, but outside of that, little bubble, all of the things that's affected them, and, ways that we can make sure that we educate other people, me as a white woman of privilege, with that privilege rather, and how to, make sure that the kids who also have that privilege carry it forward. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And you said the conversation went well. Does anybody have a situation that maybe didn't go so well? And I guess before I get that question answered, when you asked the conversation, when you're having that conversation, were they pretty forthcoming with information? Were they open to share? Same person, just like, were they open to share when you were having that conversation?
I don't know if I'm answering the right question that you're asking, AK. Could you just state the question again?
Oh, yeah. So I don't have the name, but it was the one the person was just talking. It was
Susie.
Susie, yeah. It was talking about when you're engaged in that conversation, what made it, were they forthcoming with information? Was it easy to navigate?
Susie, he's asking you.
Yeah, Susie,
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
Oh,
I was
yeah.
listening. I'm half listening to what's going on in the kitchen. What was
Okay.
the question? Sorry.
So were they forthcoming
Oh
with
yeah, no,
information?
she's very, we have a very strong friendship, and she's very open. And, like, for example, I mean, there was one time, like her son, I made a comment about how he looks so, like, all of a sudden, like, he shot up a bunch, he like got really tall all of a sudden, he looks so much older. And she said, well, yes, but I would, prefer that we don't, make comments like that, because it's hard enough for him as a Black boy already to, to be going into that age range, and he's only 10, and for people to make comments about he's looking older than his years or whatever. So she's comfortable enough to say, to tell people don't make comments like that. So yes, we have. Was that even the question? I'm not even sure.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I think what we were talking about beforehand, when we we're talking about the first step in engaging in difficult conversations, or just engaging, usually if we're just sharing parts of ourselves, if we're just sharing to understand, not to debate, right, it usually makes the conversations easier. And sometimes we have this feeling of where we're nervous to take a step forward that we never engage to begin with. And so using the framework of easy and also being able to share parts of yourselves and actively listen, it can usually make these conversations easier, right? But we want to show you sometimes there might be that opportunity situation where you're trying to have a conversation, but it may go off kilter. And we're going to show you an example of that, and we're going to show you a video, and Yasmin's going to give some background to it. But we want you, as you watch this video, to think about what you would do in this situation. But have Yasmin talk about it.
Right, so I'm not going to give you a whole lot of background to the video other than to say that this was a recording from a community education council meeting. The content itself is not so important. I just want you to think about, if you are entering into this conversation, how you might try to recover the conversation. So hopefully everyone still has the Google document with the easy framework. If not, we'll send it out in a minute. As you watch this video, I want you to think about how you, like, what they did wrong, what you would not want to do, and two, how you would try to recenter the conversation after this interaction. I'm just going to say it's very high emotions. So for those of you that are not comfortable with negative emotions, you might just want to take a breath afterwards. Oh, we don't have sound.
Sound?
Now we not try.
My friend's nephew on my lap was hurtful to people, and
friend was racist. Can you please explain?
Tom, I've explained it to you. You can Google, you can read a book. Read Bob Kennedy. Read white fragility. Read how to talk to white people. No, it's not my job to educate you. You're an educated white man, and you can read a book.
My friend will educate you.
Hey, Tom, the fact is that what you did, the act that you did, first of all, it was purposeful, it was knowing.
You're describing intent.
Yes.
Okay, how are you describing my intent?
Yes, I am. And
You're
guess
a mind reader?
Yes. No, I'm not.
You're a mind reader. That's what you're explaining.
In the moment, and you hurt
Watch me in the moment have my friend in my living room.
in your living room making a joke about segregation.
No, it was not a joke. Your actions are a joke.
You made a
Instead, I had my friend over my living room, and you thought it was
Emily and Tom, please let's let each other finish sentences. And I am going to let folks speak because it's quite apparent that people want to. I'm going to let folks speak, but I do want to
in your head,
use
not
the
mine.
back and forth and let people finish their statements. And then I also want to let council members who haven't had a chance to speak to one another. So Emily, you had started speaking. Finish what you have to say, Emily.
Thank you very much, Maud. I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right. Anne's facial expressions during those videos were very similar to mine the first like 3 times that I watched that video. All right, so I want you to take a moment to reflect. If you have a piece of paper in front of you, maybe write it on a piece of paper. First, what you would tell your kids not to do that you saw them do in that video. Again, reflecting on the EASY framework. So then just to reiterate, right now you're just listing things you would say do not do if you find yourself in this kind of conversation. And then once you've sort of listed that out, list what you would do using the EASY framework. So how might you try to save that conversation towards the end? I think the interesting thing to note too here is that we all have different comfort levels with different types of emotions. And so for some of us watching that video and seeing the sort of anger, it is very uncomfortable. And for some of us, it's completely fine, right? We know how to recover in it. So knowing sort of which emotions you're comfortable receiving is also a hard part of this work. All right, is everyone ready? All right, what are some things that you would not do that you heard them do?
You want them in the chat?
You can put them in the chat or you can just speak them out loud.
Pointing is bad.
I think screaming never gets anyone anywhere. I think they all needed to tone down what they were trying to convey because no one was listening to anybody. And it got to the point of being painful to watch it because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So they weren't listening to learn from each other, right? They were just listening to respond, if listening at all. And they were screaming. What are some other things you should not do?
They were attacking each other personally instead of only focusing on the action that had been taken or the words that had been said and how that made them feel, but they actually went for the personal jugular.
Yeah, absolutely. And what were some examples of those personal attacks?
The whole yelling of read a book. yeah, you know, that's pretty much calling someone ignorant, the way she said it. And then he went down to her level and said something to her. I don't remember what it was, but it was naughty.
Right, something along the lines of, this wasn't ridiculous, you're ridiculous, like something along those lines. What else? Yeah, so in here, Pam said they were shaming and telling each other what the others were feeling. That's a big one, right? It's making assumptions about what the other person's intentions are. And you saw him react really negatively to this, right? He said, you're not a mind reader. You can't tell what my intentions were. Any other ones that you guys want to touch on?
There's
Right, so
more in
now,
the chat as well. I was gonna say,
okay.
yeah, they're talking about like not breathing, you know, they weren't listening, you know, reviewing the S, especially, you know, what I always say that's really important is the one that's more trained needs to be able to manage the conversation. So if you know the other person is screaming, but you know that screaming back doesn't do anything, it only elevates, this might be your time to like, take a deep breath.
Yes.
Right? I know for me, when things are getting stressed, if I drop my shoulders, it elongates my neck and I'm able to breathe better, right? So with all of these, as we're practicing this, our goal is, what do you need to do for you to really manage your emotions? Because you see what happens when you're leveling each other up. It doesn't get you anywhere, right?
Now that we've highlighted the things we shouldn't do, what things could we do to recover this conversation?
Speak in a softer voice back to the person.
Right, so you can
And
sort of say,
engage in positive conversation, not negative.
good. You can try to engage in positive conversation. I'm saying breathing, listening. What is
Paraphrase, or like let the person finish and give them like nonverbal signals and thank them and acknowledge that you've heard, like validate what they're saying, this so that they'd feel heard.
Yeah.
And you can also tell people what you heard.
Right. So
and how you understood what, or how you interpreted what they had said.
yes, to both Cindy and Beverly's point, one benefit of sort of rephrasing what you just heard is, one, you validate, but two, you can clarify if you misheard something, right? So you can say, Beverly, I heard you saying X, Y, and Z. Did I get that right? Right, before you move on to the next thing. How else might you try to save this conversation? So there's use I statements, reflect back, that's great. What if you were this person at the end that tries to bring the meeting back together and says, I want to hear all voices? Is there anything that you would change about or add to what she suggested?
I think your suggestion was a good one. It probably came too late. It needed to be sooner.
Right. So it came too late. It could be sooner. When emotions flare up like that, I have some training as a mediator, and what we do is we like to try to call out the emotion a little bit. So I might say, you know, I want to step in and acknowledge that there are high emotions on this. Why don't we actually take a 5-minute break and give everyone a chance to take a breath and think about what they're trying to communicate, specifically related to community education, right? So you're reminding them that they can take the breath and refocus the conversation on the topic itself. When we come back, I'll give each person 2 minutes to speak before we go back to an open conversation, just to make sure that all voices are heard, right? So you should never be afraid of, when you're in a conversation, to take a breath yourself or to ask for a break and come back to it once emotions are lower. And this is, I mean, what happens when you're at high emotions? How easily are you able to listen to the other side?
Not at all.
Right. Yeah, we have our blinders on when we're high emotions, right?
Sound like parenting skills.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, sorry, any other last words? Yeah, like the presidential debates. Also try. You better believe I used the presidential debates when I was debriefing negotiations in one of my classes. Things not to do and things that you can do more effectively.
Yeah.
Very sad.
And I'll touch on that with what Yasmin was saying, is when we get into a situation and our tempers flare up or feel very triggered, we come into the fight or flight response, where we have binary outcomes. And oftentimes we can, if we create a third option, it actually reduces it. So what Yasmin said was, instead of the win or lose, like, no, actually, let's take a break so they now have an out. This could also be used once you're starting a conversation. It could be like, you know what, I just want to have a conversation about a topic, but if this isn't a good time, I understand, right? So giving them an out also provides a chance to reduce that resistance where they're choosing to opt in to have that conversation.
I'm wondering if the moderator could have, taken a breath and then come back and summarized kind of the two sides a little bit and let them either respond to each other or say to the person who was, I don't know, either person, like how would you have liked this to be handled? What would have been a good answer or something you would like to hear, and maybe that way they could start sharing ideas in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Lori, that's a great point. And I think that that sort of speaks volumes for having a mediator or a moderator that's part of that conversation. And this isn't to say that, yes, this is an actual incident. This isn't to say that emotions are bad or that you shouldn't sometimes let emotions play out. But at the point where you see it's completely messing up the conversation, then you can sort of reel everyone in and ask them to take a break. All right. I'm cognizant of the time, so we're going to briefly sort of talk about how tonight's structure fits into the overall vision. So we can go to, I think, the next slide. Next slide. Yeah. All right, great. So as AK mentioned before, we have these sort of 4 dimensions of racism, starting with internalized, looking inside of us to do the hard work of addressing any biases and prejudices that we might have. Interpersonal, in terms of having the comfort and courage to address racism when we see it. Institutional is sort of being reflective as a community. Sorry, AK, can you press tab again? Being reflective as a community on how we can address bias and racism within, in your case, the TVA, and then systemic, sort of with the strength of the community, how do you address these really large problems of structural racism? So we've already gone through session 1 and 2. The next session will be the conversations at TBA, where we talk about sort of at TBA how, sorry, you can change the slide. At TBA, how do we address these biases? So I will send out the link to the post-session survey, which is similar to the first survey. We just wanted to remind you that large-scale systemic work starts with reflection and personal work, and that these conversations are hard. I've been doing courageous conversations for a while, and it doesn't get that much easier, but you have to be willing to engage and make mistakes along the way. And I think that there's value in that versus sitting on the sidelines and being safe. Again, feel free to keep referring back to the EASY framework, especially with the holidays coming up, and continue to acknowledge and address your biases. Yes, I believe the slides will be made available to you, and then I will turn it over to AK. Thank you all.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Yasmin. Just thank you, Becky. Thank you, the whole Stacey, everyone on the team, and Rabbi for bringing us in. We're actually going to stay longer to actually do some Q&A, as a lot of questions were brought up in the survey. So we're going to stay extra time if anybody needs to have any questions that they need to get answered. I'll be here for actually another 30 minutes if need be, if there's any specifics. But overall, it is important that we engage in these types of conversations, because we realize if we don't engage, nothing actually happens. And the more that we engage, we then realize what works best for us. And the more you practice it, the more you actually do it, you realize, oh, wait, I noticed that person's energy kind of elevated. This is my time to, lower the temperature a little bit. And the only way to do that is to actually engage. And what I've learned from having conversations all around the world is that when you are having these conversations internally, it feels uncomfortable. But when you're actually doing it and you look at it from the outside, it actually isn't as difficult as we imagine it to be. So this session, we called it engaging in difficult conversations, but we could say just engaging in conversations. We don't want to put that difficult, we could just put easy conversations. And you realize that's how change will really happen, is once we decide to actually engage in these convos. Like we said in the link, there's a post-session survey for everyone to complete, but we'll be on just a little bit longer if you need to answer any questions that may be specific to your lives. And then if I think Rabbi wanted to say something as well, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, AK Yasmin, your input has been so critical to our moving forward in this. One of the things I think that for me, is that I was thinking about our first conversation. And, you know, I guess because I'm at that age and I have this position and stuff, I don't want to seem like a dopey white guy, you know, like that somehow every Black person has a, because I don't know what the hell's going on out there. And to come to you and to say, what's going on out there, already I'm setting myself up, because I've heard so many interviews with so many Black teachers and intellectuals and authors who I am sick of people. I was not created to answer what is the Black experience in America, which you said to me, but in a really nice way. And, you know, and then I felt like, okay, so what do we do? And I think what you're helping us with is exactly that point, which is we have to engage in conversation, just like amongst ourselves first, before we're able to then begin on a next step. And I will say, you know, I really want to be able to lean on you and Yasmin to help us, like, okay, we're in a community that is overwhelmingly not of color, which is part of the result of being Ashkenazi Jews, with various people who have married people of color. And so it's not as if we're like a whites only organization, but the Jewish people is a European based, primarily white community. And so it's not like we'd say, well, we're going to go out on a membership drive to bring in the hundreds of thousands of unaffiliated Black Jews. It's not going to happen. So we don't know what the path is, and I hope that we'll be able to do that. And towards that end, the next session, what we're going to want to drill down on particularly is the unique Jewish sensitivity to racism and the interesting double-edged sword of the Jewish response to racism, where we have sort of one extreme is people that want to do as much as they can because we have this history ingrained in us, which is all about knowing what it's like to be victims and having that kind of empathic response. And then from that same sense of victimization are Jews who have said, don't tell me about your suffering. My parents died in Auschwitz. So I guess they couldn't have because he's alive. But the point being, don't tell us about suffering and your troubles. We got to this country. We had nothing. We did it. It's your guys' problem. So don't bother me about it. So I'm being very overly simplistic, but I'm suggesting that we have these dialectical points within the Jewish community that creates all kinds of really interesting tension. And I think that's part of our own conversation moving forward. How do we debrief that? Where do we find ourselves on that? The things we heard from parents, grandparents, first generation, Jewish parents, grandparents who had, thick those European accents and what they felt about racism. And it's all part of the American Jewish character. And I think we have a lot to think about in that. And I think the more you talk about uncomfortable conversations, I think that's uncomfortable for Jews to really, frankly, face up to. But I'm hoping as we move forward, by confronting that within our own psyche, within our own tradition, I think my sense is that we'd feel more able then to engage with Black people, to be able to listen in a way to move aside some of the either intensive empathy or the intensive antipathy. You know, I think so I think that's where I think we're going to be headed in the short run anyway for our next time together.
Thank you. And I would say that the step, everyone on this call has made a step to start these conversations and engage, right? It's 7 o'clock on a Monday to talk about, you know, this topic. And it's 8:30 right now. It's to come, and it's at COVID. We got kids that are probably knocking on the door, wanting some dinner. So for you to be on this call, we just say thank you, because this is this step. And you know, we often think about like, what's the end goal? Like, where do we go to? And sometimes it is this just being, right? Being more aware and saying, when you're walking down the street and you see something going on, it's like, no, I'm going to engage. I'm going to say, like, that's not what we're about, right? Because it's a long-standing issue. I just want to say thank each and every one of you for just dedicating your time to be a part of this conversation in a huge way. And from the bottom of our heart, to really make this world, our communities, a better place. So thank you. And we'll send the slides. We'll also send in some more resources for you. If you're looking to like, I want to get started, we have some resources that we're sending to you about ways you can get involved, some more tips and some more strategies that you'll get a flood into your mailbox, because we want to make sure that you feel the most prepared in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll be on also if you have any questions. We're going to be answering some of those also from the surveys that were sent out, but we'll be here.
Thank you, AK.
Thank you, Stacey. Appreciate it.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jody, thank you so much for sharing.
Yes, thank you, Jody. Thank you.